makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
Those of you who have followed my coverage of the war, it should come as no surprise that I am 100% in support of Ukraine's defense against Russian aggression, naked Russian aggression, not some imaginary NATO-caused uh, broader geopolitical struggle. No, this is naked aggression and imperialism by one country against another. And I definitely think that NATO or the West in general can do more in terms of supporting Ukraine. Having said that, I want to be absolutely clear. One of the ideas suggested by a lot of pundits to help Ukraine is to establish a no-fly zone. And that idea is absolutely insane. It is ridiculous. It is stupid. No matter how much you support Ukraine, believe me, this is not something that you want. And, you know, uh, President Zelensky, a lot of leading Ukrainian voices have called on the West very passionately to convince them to impose a no-fly zone. I think we should respect their right to suggest it in however passionate and emotional pleas they want. This is a country that's getting bombed every single day. So yeah, they have the right to request any assistance that they want. But let's look at why this is a problem and why this is definitely the line in which the probability of starting a major war that could go nuclear has to be taken seriously. So, if you follow my Substack, you probably already read a piece in which I wrote about the risks and rewards of Western escalation. I discussed numerous suggestions on what the West could do more, mainly in the sense of providing Ukraine with considerable more material assistance in terms of military assistance. I also thought the plan of supplying the MiGs was definitely within the realms of still. I mean, it is definitely a bit more provocative than giving them anti-tank missiles or anti-air missiles, but still, I don't think that this would necessarily lead to an escalation with Russia. Remember that Russia is a country that loves to use plausible deniability in its actions. Like they love to use this. Like when they invaded the Donbass and the Crimea, they did it with troops that did not have insignia. The little green men that took over Crimea in a matter of hours. Those were regular Russian troops. But by not having insignia on them, they can basically use the plausible deniability that they're actually Russian. They've also used mercenaries and other Russian troops in Syria on numerous occasions. So Russia loves this strategy, and it would be kind of hilarious to use it against it, especially the way that the MiGs deal was going to be framed. Basically, it was Poland was going to hand it over to hand them over to the U.S. The U.S. would then sell them like for $1 each, I guess, to a private disposal company. The private disposal company would then sell it to Ukraine, I suppose, again, for $1 each or something like that. And there you go. You have them in Ukrainian hands. So that kind of stuff, I think Putin would definitely not be happy with, but I don't think that he'd go all out in suddenly saying that this is a cause for war. You got to accept the fact that the Russians, to some extent, are also bluffing. So, he has called any country that is assisting Ukraine in any way that it's going to be a declaration of war, or the sanctions are akin to a declaration of war. He hasn't done anything. So, to some extent, yeah, we need to call his bluff. But there is a point in which the likelihood of this bluff actually not being a bluff becomes more serious, and especially when the consequences of that bluff could be an all-out shooting war that could potentially involve a nuclear exchange. So here I'm going to discuss, first of all, there's two things. One is, what are the probabilities of war with Russia? And two, what are the probabilities that a war with Russia will go nuclear? Because that's really the big worry. If we had a guarantee that a war against Russia would be purely conventional, I would totally be in favor of a no-fly zone. I have no doubt in my mind that NATO could wipe the floor with Russia, especially just how appalling its performance on the battlefield has been so far. It would be the quickest war, the quickest superpower war in the history of humanity. But, and this is the big but, Russia has nukes, a lot of them. And history tells us that the more disproportion there is in power between two sides, the more likely, not less, that one will use nukes. So let's understand this first. First of all, here's a chart of the nuclear weapons inventories of both sides, Soviet Union until the 90s, Russia afterwards. So you can see that until the 1980s, there was quite an overwhelming superiority of US nuclear capability relative to Russia. I mean, even as late as 1970, the US had over twice as many warheads as Russia did, and it was only until the late 1970s that Russia obtained parity. One of the reasons that Russia, backed down from the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was because at the time, this is from 1960, Russia was very, very, very weak compared to the US in terms of its nuclear capability. Not only that, but Russia did not have the kind of delivery systems that it has available to them now. So, the nuclear ballistic missile submarines, which at the time were basically just entering service. The US had a massive disproportion of heavy bombers that they could use to bomb Russia. So Russia not only had less bombs, but less capability of bombing the US at the time, whereas the US could have obliterated Russia, So that is one of the reasons why they kind of backed down. And, well, nowadays, they're pretty even. But again, before I go here, so there was another situation. So we have until the 70s a massive disparity of strength favoring NATO in terms of nuclear weaponry. But what about conventional weapons? And here's where it gets interesting. So up until around that time, there was also NATO had the nuclear superiority, but it was really the Warsaw Pact that had the superiority in terms of conventional weapons. I tried to find an earlier chart from the 60s, but I couldn't find any. But this is from 1975, and you can see the disparity of forces in Europe at the time was pretty huge. So 58 Warsaw Pact divisions versus 27 NATO ones. 19,000 tanks versus 6,100 NATO tanks, 2,460 tactical aircraft versus 1,700 NATO tactical aircraft. So it wasn't just a material superiority, but also in terms of quality. For example, Russian tanks at the time were as good, if not better, than your average Western tanks. So this was definitely an imbalance of power that was even worse in the decade before this. So in the 1950s and 60s, this difference was much, much, much bigger. So it was widely believed at the time that NATO would not be able to resist a Soviet attack into West Germany. So NATO had a policy known as massive retaliation. What it meant was that any hostile action taken by the Warsaw Pact against the West during this period would be met by a massive military nuclear response by NATO. So the moment that a Soviet tank platoon crossed the border into West Germany, you would have the ICBMs and bombers nuke the hell out of Russia. That was intended so that Russia did not think of invading Western Europe because the retaliation would be huge. Now, this changed in 1967. In 1967, NATO adopted a strategy known as flexible response. Flexible response meant that it would respond to Russian aggression in kind. So if Russia started a conventional war, then NATO would respond conventionally. If Russia used a tactical nuke, now tactical nuke is different from a strategic nuke. Tactical nuke is basically a relatively small nuclear weapon used in a battlefield against a battlefield objective, so against a concentration of troops, something like that. It's not meant to blow up a city, annihilate a city. So Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not tactical nukes; they were strategic nukes. And most of the bigger weapons, the ICBMs, etc., those are the strategic nukes. But the tactical nukes would be used only for battlefield objectives, and so would be limited in terms of the destruction and the civilian casualties that they would cause. So if Russia used tactical nukes, then NATO would respond with tactical nukes. And then if Russia responded with strategic nukes, NATO would respond with strategic nukes. So it was a bit of a tit for tat. Flexible response pretty much dominated kind of the nuclear warfighting strategies for the remainder of the Cold War. And it did so as well because, like I said, by that time, Russia was closing in on the West in terms of its own nuclear capabilities. So by the 80s, both sides could pretty much wipe each other out. Not only that, they would survive a first strike. So the issue of first strike was very important during the Cold War. First strike basically meant that one side could lose a nuclear war if the other side bombed its nuclear facilities first. So if the US bombed Russia's ICBM silos and bomber bases, that's it. You're knocked out. You lost because you don't have a chance to respond. Nuclear submarines pretty much changed that because a nuclear submarine could be anywhere in the world. And so even if your enemy destroys your bomber bases and your ICBM silos, those submarines could be anywhere and they will fire a second strike that will wipe you out. So the moment that second strikes became feasible in the 60s, kind of this whole idea that an initial massive retaliatory nuclear strike against the other could prevent any retaliation from that country. So ironically, the advent of nuclear submarines made nuclear war much more much less winnable and therefore less likely to happen. So the other thing was that from the late 70s onward, NATO became much more powerful in terms of its conventional capabilities. By this time, there was a realization by NATO that it could win a conventional war against the Warsaw Pact. This was largely because there was a revolution in military technology in terms of command and control, precision weaponry, things like that, which NATO had an advantage over the Soviets. And, this completely changed the kind of warfighting doctrine that NATO had. And the best example of this is something called the air-land battle doctrine, which you can Google it if you want. This was basically the revised NATO strategy from the 1980s to confront the Soviet Union. And air-land battle was applied very successfully during the 1991 Gulf War against an enemy that was mostly equipped with Soviet weapons and Soviet tactics. Now, given the results of the Gulf War, it became obvious that NATO probably would have won a conventional war against Russia. And, well, this, again, if, say, one side was winning a conventional war, there was still a likelihood, or a risk rather, that any such war could, if Russia was suddenly losing against NATO, then it would try and revert the balance of the conflict by using tactical nukes. We don't know. We really don't know. But the fact is, by the late Cold War, nuclear war became less likely, not more likely. This might seem a bit strange considering how militaristic things had gotten in the 1980s with Reagan at the time, calling Russia an evil empire, etc. But the fact is, by then it was less likely. In fact, in 1982, the Soviet Union under Brezhnev declared that it would have a no first strike policy. That is, it would not be the country that initiated the nuclear war. This was quite surprising. I mean, we don't know if they would have actually followed through with it, but this was quite a gesture, which ironically the U.S. did not follow through with. The US and none of the other NATO countries ever decided that they would respond to this with their own proclamation of a no first strike. So unfortunately, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia basically rolled back this strategy. So after 1993, they put it back, and since 2000, they had a revision to their nuclear warfighting doctrine, where they made it very clear that they would use nuclear weapons if necessary. So they call this, ironically, a de-escalation. And yeah, so in 2000s, they had this new policy where, let's see where it says it. I think I may have forgotten where in this article it says, but yeah, basically it was a very kind of open-ended doctrine in terms of anything that they felt would result in some kind of strategic threat to Russia, that they had a right to use nuclear weapons. And then they changed. Oh yeah, so whereas in the 2000 document allowed for their use in situations critical to national security. So that is a very vague term. It can be used like the current war with Ukraine. They could certainly frame it as situations critical to national security and therefore use nukes. Then they revised it in 2010, where it says the very existence of the state is under threat. So you would need a bigger excuse for that. But would a war with NATO right now fall into this category? Certainly there's no reason to think it wouldn't. If NATO is that much more powerful than Russia, then Russia could interpret that as being a threat to its very existence as a state. So this could result in Russia using nukes. Now, let's look at, we talked about how the military balance, when it's uneven, raises the risk of nuclear war. And the risk is that now we have the biggest disparity in force since the 1950s. Except this time it's to NATO's favor, not Russia's. So this is a comparison of major equipment and troop levels. NATO has 3.5 million active troops versus 771,000 active troops in Russia. Massive disparity in ballistic missile submarines, in aircraft, in combat aircraft, main battle tanks, 9,460 from NATO. Over half of this is just the US and Turkey, by the way. Actually, that number seems a bit high, because a lot of the other NATO countries don't have that big tank forces. But US and Turkey both have over 2,000 tanks in active service. Russia, 2,600. Frigates, 122 versus 10. Armored infantry fighting vehicles, over twice as many. So this is not even, and aircraft carriers, 13-1. So this is just, this is pretty overwhelming. I don't know what year is this. This is probably not super new, but it's probably from around 2015 or later. This is a complete disparity of force. No one in their right minds would assume that Russia would win against NATO, given these numbers, especially considering the fact that it's not just a numerical superiority, it's a technical superiority. Each of these NATO tanks is much better than your average Russian tank. Much newer, I should add as well, because a lot of Russia's tanks, if you've looked at the videos from the Ukraine war, are very old, kind of late 1960s models like the T-72 that have been upgraded, but they still retain a lot of the flaws of such an old design. So qualitatively and numerically, NATO has a massive disparity of force with Russia, which raises the risk that Russia will resort to nukes to make up for this difference in conventional weaponry. So those are basically the reasons why I do think that the no-fly zone, which would involve the likelihood, very high likelihood, that NATO warplanes would be engaged with Russian warplanes or Russian air defense systems incredibly risky, because the moment that a NATO plane shoots down a Russian plane, or vice versa, or just undertakes any hostile military action against Russian forces, then that will lead to war. And a war that clearly is not in Putin's favor conventionally, which means he would resort to nukes. Now, let's also talk a bit about Putin, because Putin does not seem to be like the most stable individual in this world. More importantly, he has control over the apparatus of state to an extent that no Soviet premier ever had. And let's give it to them. Even if you think the Soviet Union was an evil empire, the fact of the matter is that Soviet premiers were statesmen. They had a concept of geopolitics. They knew when they could win. They also knew when they would lose, like in Afghanistan. So, Khrushchev, the way that he handled the Cuban Missile Crisis is a great example of someone like. He would definitely have handled it. He definitely handled it much better than Putin would if Putin had been the premier at the time, because Putin is a guy who simply does not know the concept of "I lost." So this is very risky, and because he has such a strong control of the apparatus of state, it is possible that the safeguards that existed during Soviet times to prevent a nuclear war from happening might no longer exist, or might not be as strong as they were before. And remember, this was a debate that occurred when Trump was in power. There were plenty of articles at the time wondering, what if Trump decides to start a nuclear war? Who's going to stop him? What are these safeguards? Could the military deny him? If he gives the order, can the military deny that order? The answer is yes, by the way. It is safe to say that those safeguards also existed during Soviet times, but who knows if they exist now? Who knows? We don't know. It's not to say that Putin has a red button that he can press, but the fact of the matter is we don't know whether those safeguards exist. So the risk is there, and I don't think the reward for a no-fly zone is worth it, especially considering there are still many other ways in which Ukraine can be assisted. So another plan that is currently being discussed, because the MiG plan was shot down by the US because they thought it was a needless risk, which clearly is the sign of a country that really wants to go to war with Russia. As the tankies insist, not just the tankies, but a lot of the left as well. These are not the signs of a country that wants to escalate. So what other things can be done? There's many NATO countries that still use Soviet air defense equipment that can be handed over. Probably, the MiGs deal was quite symbolic in many ways, but I suspect the grand majority of Russian aircraft have been shot down by air defense systems, ground-based air defense systems, not by Ukrainian fighter jets. The ghost of Kiev is known as such because it's not true. And there might have been pilots that have shot down a handful of Russian aircraft, but by no means it's the majority. So, and according to the US itself, the Ukrainian Air Force is largely intact. That is the direct quote. So, it doesn't seem to make sense. But let's look at how the press has presented this, and this is to me the best example. It's from the UK. This is Nick Ferrari. He's a right-wing radio host. I find him one of the most obnoxious people in British public life, and there's not much I can describe him that would not resort into a diatribe of profanity, but. Just listen to this. This is just pure, I want clicks.
While evidence is being gathered, Minister, mothers and babies are being blown up.
Yeah, that is the utterly abhorrent
Well, what are you going to do about it? I mean, whose idea was it to take off the table the sanction of a no-fly zone So Putin has been handed the absolute gem of knowing that NATO's never going to do that. Who took that decision? It's insanity.
Well, I dispute that, Nick. For two reasons.
You think it's a good idea to let Putin... Hang on a second, respectfully, sir, and indeed both as a minister and a major. 1 second. If you take off a key tactic, right, such as imposing a no-fly zone, Putin and his cronies sit in the Kremlin and say, we have got free hand, carte blanche to do what we like. I put it to you again, as a senior military man and a minister, that was purely insane.
No, I disagree.
You know, if Nick Ferrari is really that desperate for war with Russia, he can already enlist in the international legions. He looks like he's in great shape, by the way, to go fight war.
For two reasons. Firstly, I think that it is perfectly possible to support the Ukrainians with anti-aircraft missile systems that allow them to effectively close their skies. Secondly, on a technical point, as the Chief of the Defence Staff rightly said when he was on the BBC Sunday morning show the other day, it is tactically inconsequential to close the sky, given that so much of what is causing the devastation that you're seeing on your TV screens is artillery and missile systems, which of course are not affected by a no-fly.
Yeah, pretty much. I'm a bit disappointed that he wasn't called out on, like, Nick, do you understand what the risks of this are? Would you like me to explain to your viewers what war with Russia entails? But, you know, this is, British politicians catering to the punditocracy in that sense, at least in terms of, not challenging them on their shit takes, but thankfully not listening to them in what the correct military response should be. So, on that note, I hope this was a good explanation of why no-fly zones are bad. And yeah, we can still call for NATO and the West to do much more to support Ukraine, but it has to be in the context of what is responsible escalation and what isn't. And I definitely think a no-fly zone crosses the threshold of when escalation becomes completely irresponsible. But pundits be punditing, and this is all good for generating outrage and clicks. But we should be a bit smarter than that. On that note, if you like this video, please like, please share. Most importantly, please subscribe, and I will see you next time.